and I am so gratified to see all of you here tonight. I really did not know what to expect. I was afraid I might walk into an auditorium and see 5 or 6 people, so I'm especially glad to see you here. I'm Kathleen Verdine. I teach in the English department here at Hope College, but I also have the privilege of chairing the A.J. Muste Memorial Lecture Committee this year. As many of you already know, A.J. Muste was internationally known in his lifetime as an inspired and tireless activist for international peace, and he was also a graduate of Hope College. The annual Muste Lecture will take place in March 6th to be exact, and will be delivered by Leela Danielson, who is author of the acclaimed biography, American Gandhi, A.J. Muste and the History of Radicalism in the 20th Century. But it also seemed desirable to raise awareness of Muste by focusing on his origins here in West Michigan, in the Reformed Church in America, and at Hope College. That's what we'd like to do tonight. And it's fitting we should do this on All Saints' Day, because Muste, of course, has been called a saint. Thank you. I will briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll have the pleasure of seeing some footage edited by David Schock from his documentary in progress, at present titled Radical for Peace, A.J. Muste and the American Conscience. First speaker is John Cox. He's the Emeritus Dumais Professor of English here at Hope. He joined the faculty in 1979 after receiving a PhD from the University of Chicago. During his tenure, he taught the works of Shakespeare every semester, and he did so as well in summer sessions at Harvard and the University of California at Berkeley. He is the author of 3 books on Shakespeare, is that right, and other English dramatists, but his interest in local culture sparked his 2014 volume on the 100-year history of Maple Avenue Ministries. Judy Parr earned a PhD in English from The Ohio State University. Her career includes journalism, technical writing, and teaching English at several universities. Since her return to Holland in 2003, she has been active in the Hope Academy of Senior Professionals and currently serves as president of the organization. She too is the author of a book on local church history titled Hope Church, Holland, Michigan, The First 150 Years, which appeared in 2012. Jeffrey Meyers is a PhD student at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, where he is at work on a dissertation titled Nonviolent Counter-Discourse and the Book of Revelations. Jeffrey's interest in religious pacifism led him to edit a collection of Muste's writings titled The Way of Peace, A.J. Muste's Writings for the Church, which appeared last year. And Jeffrey has kindly brought a number of copies of this volume, which I believe he will have available after our meeting. Ethan Cronkite is the host and founder of Craft Away Camp, an annual summer retreat for adults. Now in its 5th year, Craft Away is a beloved tradition that encourages creativity and opportunity through craft workshops in the Michigan outdoors. The camp is one of many gatherings hosted by Small Craft, Ethan's family business, which has produced numerous creative workshops in bars, shops, and fairs around the Midwest. Ethan is known around Detroit as a founder and curator of the Trumbleplex Zine Library, an extensive collection of handmade publications shelved in a historic housing collective and art space. It was Ethan's father, the late Dr. Donald Cronkite, who established the A.J. Muste Memorial Lecture at Hope. And then finally, David Schock holds an MA in journalism from Central Michigan University and a PhD in creative writing and literary criticism from International College in Los Angeles. He has taught courses in writing, communication, and media production, with writing in a number of genres, including fiction. He has produced 3 films about contemporary African American poets, the last of which, a Detroit poet laureate, Naomi Magid, earned the 2011 Outstanding Documentary Award from the Historical Society of Michigan. He received the same award for his 2013 film on Michigan Native American sharpshooters, but he is best known for half a dozen gripping documentaries on unsolved homicides, beginning with his well-known production, Who Killed Janet Chandler, a film about the murder of a Hope College student in 1979. As a direct result of David's work, 5 of these murders have now been solved. It's probably appropriate that I conclude this introduction with a quotation. So here it is. I believe that the power of redemption is released whenever any person, man or woman, in any culture, deliberately decides to risk hardship or death to nonviolently oppose injustice and aggression. You might be thinking that these are the words of A.J. Muste, and they certainly sound that way, but they are not. They come from the autobiography of a man who knew A.J. intimately and collaborated with him on some of the most important projects that A.J. undertook. And we are honored to have him tonight to be with us. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Bradford Little.
Well, that would work, David, if you would, please. I'll just cue you, and it's the mouse right there. The first picture, which is on the screen, is the basketball team on which A.J. Muste played as an undergraduate at Hope College, 1945, as indicated at the bottom of that picture. They had a 7-1 record during the regular season. A.J.'s holding the ball. He was captain of the team. The manager, I couldn't find that there was a coach, but that man in the suit is the manager, somebody called Rudolph Nicholas. It's the 4th season of Hope basketball. I entered Hope as a first-year student, first slide, in 1963. President Kennedy, second slide, was in the 3rd year of his presidency, and the U.S. had 16,000 advisors in Vietnam. Their purpose was to train South Vietnamese armed forces in the struggle to prevent the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia. Kennedy declared officially that Vietnam was the place where communism would be stopped. I was more interested in this conflict than most American students were. My parents were missionaries in nearby Thailand. Slide, please. You're doing fine. I didn't cue you on Kennedy.
Oh boy, what you get when you don't get good help? No.
We don't want to start broadcast.
No, where are we? Oh, yeah, you can do that. Good. So much for
Just cancel out of that. The other way. And we're beyond that now. That one doesn't seem to work. You just have to use the black. Okay, and all right, we're into Thailand. Excellent, okay. Where I'd spent a substantial portion of my childhood. I had not been to Vietnam, but I had once crossed the Mekong River and had set foot in Laos, next door to Vietnam. My parents were in Chiang Rai at the very top of Thailand on the map. President Kennedy was assassinated, slide, in November of my first year in college, and his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, slide, succeeded him in office. Are we up to Johnson? Next one, please. There we go. There's Johnson. Johnson was more aggressive than Kennedy. He found an excuse to increase American involvement in Vietnam after North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked a U.S. Navy ship in July of 1964. Unable to defeat guerrilla activity by the Viet Cong in the South, the U.S. responded with Rolling Thunder, slide, a bombing campaign against communist North Vietnam, a strong supporter of guerrillas in the South with weapons, supplies, and morale. This campaign ignored the lesson taught by the German bombing of London in World War II. Short of total destruction, civilians under bombs become more resourceful, and their determination to persist increases. At the same time, Johnson ordered increasing numbers of U.S. troops to Vietnam. By the spring of 1965, my fourth semester at Hope, the American presence in Vietnam involved almost 30,000 troops, with 3,500 U.S. Marines storming the beach at Da Nang in March, slide. Their landing was completely unopposed. By the end of 1965, the U.S. commitment in Vietnam had risen to almost 200,000 troops. I was deeply skeptical of Johnson's anti-communist rhetoric, and I was convinced that U.S. involvement in South Vietnam was futile. Here I am, a sophomore. I argued vociferously with fellow students. We bandied about words and phrases such as quagmire, land war in Asia, the domino effect, a phrase describing the sequent fall of countries to communism. I conceded that South Vietnam would probably become communist if the U.S. did not support it, but I pointed out that communist countries did not exist apart from the international community. Their survival depended on a worldwide market economy from which they could not isolate themselves. Over time, I argued, a communist Vietnam would respond pragmatically, and eventually it would operate effectively in global capitalism, even as a communist country. Perhaps its people would suffer under communism, but they were already suffering from American bullets and bombs. In this state of affair, my discovery of A.J. Muste, slide, in the spring of 1965 was an enormous encouragement. Muste was a Hope alumnus, slide, arguably the most famous alumnus the college has produced, a Reformed Church minister, slide, who had opposed earlier wars, slide, and actively opposed the war in Vietnam, 3 slides, until his death at age 82 in 1967. He was a powerful model and inspiration to the handful of us at Hope who objected to the war in Vietnam. We were aware of protests against the war led by Mario Savio at Berkeley, slide, but Muste was more credible for us because he offered a distinctively Christian, specifically Reformed precedent, even had a Dutch name. By the spring of my junior year in 1966, U.S. troop levels in Vietnam had increased to almost 400,000, more than twice the commitment of just 1 year earlier. Agitated about equally by the growing U.S. incursion and by the general indifference of Hope students to it, a small group of us decided to take a public stand. In Holland, Michigan, nothing is more public than the Tulip Time Parade, which at that time took place when the college was still in session. 10 of us, slide, decided to prepare placards opposing the war. We wore our Sunday best so we would not be dismissed as hippies, and we concealed the placards in blankets as we stood watching the parade, 5 of us on one side of 8th Street and 5 on the other. When a substantial gap appeared after the Holland High marching band had passed, we nodded to each other across the street, left the concealing blankets with friends, and walked into the parade, arranging ourselves in 2 lines of 5 with our placards held high. As we passed the viewing stand for visiting dignitaries, we could see that the announcer for the parade was confused. He kept looking at us and looking at the paper that described the order of marching groups in the parade. Momentarily, he fell silent, picking up only when he recognized the group behind us. The police did not bother us. They had not seen us enter from the sidelines. We were quiet and orderly. They did not know we were interlopers. Most people watched us silently, slide, but some called out insults, invective, and shame. No one offered encouragement of any kind. We were glad to reach the end of the parade without having anything thrown at us except angry words. I don't know how A.J. Muste, last slide, would have responded to our mild civil disturbance, but I'm quite sure he would have been a lone voice cheering us from the sidewalk had he been there. What I do know is how I responded to A.J. Muste. He was a model, an inspiration, and a potent intellectual resource for our opposition to the Vietnam War. When we explained our action afterwards to the anchor and the WHTC's Talk of the Town, we repeatedly invoked Muste, thereby helping to spread his influence from the dusty annals of church history to the living citizens of Holland. I hope some of them remembered him gratefully in subsequent years when the nation as a whole grew tired of the stalemate in Vietnam and turned decisively against the war. Thank you, Judy.
As I read several biographies about A.J. Muste, I wondered what early experiences influenced him to become a radical for peace. Muste wrote, "My mother, more than once in later years, remarked that during the first year of my existence, I cried virtually without interruption all day, but slept like a top at night. This was a pattern which I have in some sense followed most of my life. Since I am usually sounding off about something a good part of every day, and practically never have any trouble about sleeping at night." All this crying, perhaps he was a protester from even his infancy. In 1891, when he was 6 years old, he and his family immigrated from the small seacoast town of Zierikzee in the Netherlands. They migrated to the growing city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Hearing Dutch, he soon needed to also master English. 2 countries, 2 languages, complexity. In Grand Rapids, his family were met by his uncles, his mother's brothers, and their families. These are families that had emigrated several years earlier. His uncles' families had joined the Christian Reformed Church, the Gereformeerde Kerk, and A.J. and his parents were from the Reformed Church, the Hervormde Kerk. When Christian Reformed Church authorities would not receive the Mustes by transfer of membership from the Reformed Church, requesting instead that they make a renewed confession of faith, Adriana Muste, A.J.'s mother, refused, and the family turned to the Fourth Reformed Church, which accepted their membership by transfer. Young A.J. likely noticed some of this friction between 2 denominations. Not all churches were alike. His parents sent A.J. first to a Christian school, a place, as he quotes, of safe and sacred learning, where he complained of having to memorize all 176 verses of Psalm 119. His parents then enrolled him in a public school. In the 8th grade, his teacher encouraged him to enter an essay contest sponsored by the Trades and Labor Council of Grand Rapids. His essay on child labor won the prize. And among the books he bought with his prize money was a volume by Ralph Waldo Emerson, his essays. And Muste claimed that these were the most seminal influence of all on his thinking. Hoping that their son would be well prepared for entering the ministry, A.J.'s parents sent him at the age of 13 to the Hope Preparatory School in Holland, equivalent to a high school college prep for Hope College. As a student worker in the library, he was allowed to access all of the books, including those by Charles Darwin, Origin of the Species, and others. He also was drawn to Philip Gilbert Hamerton's The Intellectual Life, a book that argued for free inquiry and disparaged dogma. Muste later reminisced, "I remember being scolded by a seminarian from my home church in Grand Rapids for tasting surreptitiously of the forbidden fruit. The seminarian predicted, all this will come to no good end. And here, of course, he was right. This desire for more challenging kinds of learning led to Muste's attempt to transfer from Hope College to the University of Kansas at the end of his sophomore year. He changed his mind only after the president of Hope College, Garrett J. Holland, intervened with the contention that Muste's duty as a Dutchman was to the college. Muste stayed, immersing himself in oratorical contests and sports in addition to his studies. When his Greek professor, Edward Dimnant, allowed students in his senior course to act out Sophocles' tragedy Antigone, A.J. played the role of Haemon, the son of Creon. Haemon was forced to choose between obeying his father and being loyal to Antigone, to whom he was engaged. He was a man caught between following kingly rules and the will of the gods. Haemon chose the latter. Victorian of the class of 1905, A.J. Muste chose as his topic the problem of discontent. The inevitable fruit of all life and progress is dissatisfaction and unrest, he began. His concluding words, the eternal unrest of humanity and the discontent of soul urge men to action, and in action is the principle of all progress on the part of the race and the ultimate warrant of peace to the individual. 30 years later, a nephew sent Muste a copy of that speech. I was astonished, Muste said, at what it foretold of my life. Muste could have enrolled where 6 of his 13 Hope College classmates did, across the street at Western Theological Seminary. But he chose the more liberal seminary in the East, New Brunswick Theological Seminary. There, he was soon disappointed to learn that it placed more emphasis on indoctrination than upon learning, and valued fidelity more than intellectual growth. Because he wanted more, he also took courses in philosophy at New York University and Columbia. At Columbia, he heard William James lecture on pragmatism, and he met John Dewey, an advocate of learning by doing. As a graduation speaker for the 1909 class of the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, he probably didn't endear himself to anyone there, but he criticized the low intellectual standards of the seminary, stating that it should be, quote, an institution in which only the most mediocre kind of parish ministers are trained. It should not be that. It should not be an institution in which only the mediocre kind of parish ministers are trained. During his first pastorate at the newly organized Fort Washington Collegiate Church in New York City, he earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree, magna cum laude, from Union Seminary. He voted for President candidate Socialist Party member Eugene V. Debs, and he took an interest in nearby garment workers' strikes for better working conditions and fairer wages. He was well on his way from accepting the faith of his fathers to taking a journey that transformed his beliefs into social action. A.J. Muste's experience as an immigrant, as a child exposed to 2 church denominations and a variety of schools, as an avid learner who wanted to break away from the confines of indoctrination, all these experiences prepared him for a life that questioned injustices and war and promoted actions of nonviolence as he became a radical for peace.
So I've been asked to talk a little about Muste's faith journey and his connection to the church of his youth, the Reformed Church in America. So Muste's faith was important to him from an early age, and at the age of 13, he became a member of his church, which was highly unusual to join at that young of an age. And he declared a calling to be a pastor, which is actually what allowed him to get the scholarships to attend essentially high school and then college here at Hope. Now, since Dr. Parr has already talked about Muste's time at Hope, I'm going to skip ahead to his time in his first pastorate while he was taking classes for fun at Union. He didn't know he earned a degree until they told him he had. He already had his seminary degree, after all, from New Brunswick. But that time was a very challenging time for him because Union Theological Seminary was one of the most liberal schools in the country, and his RCA schools maybe not so much. He was learning the latest in biblical studies, new theological ideas like the social gospel, and was a voracious reader of the Christian mystics. To some extent, this meant abandoning some of the ideas that he had been taught here at Hope and at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. And he was conflicted enough to consider leaving pastoring because of this. He even applied for the job of history professor here at Hope in 1913. And after being offered the position, he declined, deciding that taking the job would mean running away from the problems he was having. A year later, he was asked, as were all RCA pastors, to certify his agreement with church doctrine. No longer believing in the literal interpretation of Scripture or in all of the conservative Calvinist doctrines of that era, he refused. Instead, he had to resign his pastorate and leave the RCA. Now, he quickly found another position outside of the RCA as the pastor of a Congregationalist church near Boston. When World War I led him toward pacifism, he had to resign from that church as well, and was employed for a short time by a Quaker meeting. He and his family moved into a house shared with other pastors kicked out of their churches due to their pacifism, a house rented for them by the pacifist organization, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. These pastors were part of a loosely organized group of Christian pacifists who referred to themselves as the Comradeship. Now, soon after, in 1919, this group became involved in a large strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which was famous for a very violent strike 6 years earlier. Muste was eager to try out his newfound pacifist ideas and urged the strike organizers to use nonviolence. Despite beatings by police, the threat of police machine guns mounted on the street corners, labor spies inciting violence, and the arrest of many, including Muste, the strike adhered to nonviolence and was eventually successful. Before it was over, he had been elected the head of the union that was leading the strike. He would continue to work in the labor movement until 1936, heading multiple unions, political organizations, and for many years, a labor college. During this time, Muste, like many liberal Christians of that era, was drawn to socialist ideas. He began to see little difference between the new social order of the left and the new social order of the kingdom of God. This is not to say that he was a communist. Most of his time in the labor movement, the organizations he headed, were in conflict with the communists. The one time he strayed from this pattern was when, in 1934, his American Workers' Party merged with a Trotskyite group exiled from the Communist Party. This signaled the extreme of his movement toward what he usually referred to as Marxist-Leninism. It also required his outward renunciation of pacifism. He left the church at the same time, although he writes that he never believed or stated that God was not real. His move away from the church and pacifism, plus the fact that he vehemently disagreed with the direction the Trotskyists were taking their combined organization, eventually sent him into an intellectual and spiritual crisis. The crisis was resolved when, on a vacation paid for by friends, Muste wandered into a Paris church, where he had a deep mystical experience of God. He heard an inner voice saying, "This is where you belong, inside the church, not outside it." This led Muste to leave the labor movement, renounce Marxist-Leninism, re-embrace pacifism, and return to the church. After his reconversion to Christianity and pacifism, Muste devoted much of his time to preaching Christianity as the true alternative to communism. In 1937, he returned to pastoring as the director of the Presbyterian Labor Temple in New York City. And from that time on, he tended to refer to himself as simultaneously both a Presbyterian and a Quaker. He liked to joke that it would really mess with church statistics if situations like his were common. Upon his reconversion to Christianity and pacifism, he was invited to speak at a number of Reformed Church in America events, including at General Synod in 1937, where he issued a resounding call for the RCA to maintain the stance against war it had adopted after World War I. And I have a few copies of that speech that I'll have available afterwards for anybody who's interested. It's also in my book. In 1940, Muste reluctantly left the Presbyterian Labor Temple to lead the U.S. branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was at the center of Protestant pacifism during that period. At the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Muste did anti-war work, assisted conscientious objectors, and advocated for the preservation of civil liberties during World War II, and led the fellowship to play a large role in laying the foundations for the civil rights movement. As the fellowship was treated as a quasi-denomination, he often represented it at meetings of the World Council of Churches and helped plan theology conferences for the WCC. He also headed many other organizations during this time and helped bring together many coalitions within the peace movement. He was well known for his ability to bring normally antagonistic groups of people and strong personalities together for a common cause. Muste retired from the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the mid-1950s and spent the rest of his life participating in ecumenical work and peace activism. He passed away in 1967, as we've heard, at the age of 82, not long after a trip to North Vietnam, where he met with North Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh and other officials as part of his work toward an end to the Vietnam War. Now, Muste was a pastor and theologian whose life and work was grounded in a deep Christian faith. While he was rooted in the tradition of his youth, he integrated influences from a wide range of Christian traditions. When speaking to Quakers, he did so as a Quaker. When speaking to a Reformed audience, he did so as someone raised in that tradition. When speaking to the left, he did so as a highly respected former labor leader who still cared deeply about the cause of social justice. And when speaking to all Americans, he did so as someone deeply concerned about the health and preservation of democracy. His ability to bring together many diverse groups and traditions helped make him one of the most remarkable public theologians of the 20th century. Thank you.
I had not put it together until I arrived here this evening that we would be gathering here in this particular room. When I was a young child, my father used to bring me here to, in the evenings, to share in the enjoyment of a series of classic film screenings. Most notably, one that I always describe as one of the top 2 or 3 cinematic experiences of my life. We saw the Marx Brothers film, A Night at the Opera, here, which is most well known for the scene in which a very large crowd of people is fit into a very small cabin on a cruise ship. And that was the moment when I discovered that a comedy is so much funnier when everyone in the dark room around you is laughing along with it as well. I always really vividly remember that moment where everyone in the room was just united in helpless laughter. And it was especially great to look over and see my father sitting there next to me, just helpless with laughter there. It was a great moment. I kind of wish now that I know this, that I would have prepared more jokes in my presentation. We could try to replicate that experience, but it's really not very humorous at all. But maybe that story fits in some other way. Look at that. Look at This was a well-known phrase of my father, Dr. Donald Cronkite. And at his memorial service this past spring, these words were quoted by his colleague in the Hope College Biology Department, Dr. Kathy Winnett Murray. Look at that. What she was remembering was the clear excitement my father would feel when he saw something that connected to one of his many interests, and the charming way he had of sharing that excitement with everyone around him. Sometimes the cause of his excitement was connected to his professional field of biology. But Donald Cronkite was not one to be confined by narrow boundaries. So just as often, he would share his excitement about an interest from outside his academic department. One such interest was A.J. Muste. My father founded Hope's A.J. Muste Memorial Lecture series in 1984 and chaired the series coordinating committee for over 20 years. He worked tirelessly to draw Hope's attention to Muste, even when some might have preferred that the college look away. So, one of many ways to understand the lecture series is as a great, enduring example of Donald Cronkite saying, "Look at that." I suspect that one part of the appeal for my father was Muste's complex relationship with Hope College, where he can be seen as both insider and outsider. As a youth, Muste fit neatly inside the expectations for a Hope student. We've seen many examples of that already here this evening. Captaining the basketball team, marrying his college sweetheart, and going on to become a Reformed minister. But later in life, as we've also seen, he traveled well outside the expectations for an alumnus. So we see him founding a socialist party or leading worker strikes, publishing a Marxist newspaper. None of this fits neatly into anyone's ideas about Hope College. I think that story may have resonated with my father, who in his own way was also both insider and outsider at Hope. When you first begin to examine Dr. Cronkite's legacy, you might see him as one of Hope College's insiders. You might see that he taught at Hope College for 32 years, that he was a member of the Hope College Board of Trustees, the Campus Life Board, the Religious Life Committee, the Student Life Committee, and the Library Planning Committee. You might see that he was Hope's commencement speaker in 1988, and that he won the college's Outstanding Professor Educator Award that same year. You might look at all that and draw some conclusions about Donald Cronkite's beliefs, values, and ideals. But in many ways, those conclusions would be wrong. So I'm glad that the A.J. Muste Memorial Lecture Series is also a big part of his legacy. Because when you arrive at that part of the story, you might pause to realize that there was even more to Donald Cronkite than his long and distinguished career at Hope College might seem to suggest. My father's last public address was at Hope, and he was speaking about A.J. Muste. At that time, my father's Parkinson's was quite advanced, and although he knew what he wanted to say, it was difficult for him to put his thoughts in order. It was difficult for him to take the stage, to stand behind the podium, and to reach the end of his remarks. Throughout his career, he'd relied on his gifts as a speaker. But as that career reached its end, he found the success of his speech to be a bit less certain. He opened with the story of Muste attending a Quaker worship service in the 1940s. I know a bit about this type of worship because it was another interest that my father was excited to share. He used to take us to these services from time to time, and sometimes would even host them in our home. At this type of Quaker service, no one is supposed to arrive with a prepared text or any particular plans to speak. The friends sit silently together and wait to see what will happen. And every now and then, a participant will find the right words for the moment and will feel the need to share them with the others. The belief is that these words are coming directly from God, and to truly hear and share that small, still voice is, and ought to be, a frightening experience. So, my father is overcoming his illness in order to pull his words together, to take the stage, and to share this story with the crowd. And in the story, Muste is overcoming his fear in order to rise to his feet, to break the silence, and to share the words that have come to him. And both men persevere and overcome all their obstacles, and we hear these words: "If I can't love Hitler, I can't love at all." Now, those aren't easy words to hear or to say. There might be an interesting idea about pacifism there, but it doesn't fit neatly into anyone's story about the world. So it's striking that we find these two men pushing so hard against their limitations in order to share such an idea with the people around them. We see there a testimony to the great value of this kind of difficult speech. In the end, Muste and his words sink back down into the silence, and Donald Cronkite goes on to finish his final public address and receives a standing ovation. And here we are, all these years later, still trying to figure out how to fit this difficult idea into our lives. My father liked to take his family on nature hikes, where he would share his vast knowledge of the natural world and his keen insights into its deepest inner workings. We would be walking through the woods, and he would suddenly stop and point out some leaf or insect that I would never have thought to examine. And as he would tell me more about it, we would share a connection for a moment, and I would start to understand his interest. And by the time we moved on down the trail, my understanding of the world would have expanded. Those moments when he shared his interests were expressions of love, and we both could feel that, but it wasn't something that we put into words. So over time, we both came to understand our relationship as one in which our feelings for each other were expressed in this indirect, understated kind of way. A few years ago, I began to feel that I ought to tell him more directly that I loved him. But those words wouldn't have fit neatly into our understanding of the relationship. So I was pushing against a lot of fear whenever I tried to say them. And then his mind began to fade. And then he slowly stopped talking altogether, so that it was very hard to know what he was taking in. And then he was unconscious. And then he was gone. The moment for those words had passed. Did my father know I loved him? Of course. Do I regret not saying it out loud? Every day. I share these stories as a reminder to all of us here tonight. All of us have moments when we know the words that ought to be said, but find it challenging to get them out. And when those moments come, it's important that we push ourselves to make the most of them. Some few of us will have the kind of moments A.J. Muste was known for, when we need to stand and make bold political statements. All of us will have moments when we need to share some difficult words with our loved ones. And every day, we'll all have countless opportunities to turn to the people beside us and say, "Look at that. Look at that." Thank you.
When I first came to Hope College, Don taught me as a part of a welcome for new faculty, and there were these familiarization sessions, and he did a spectacular job. And that was the first of many. Hey, Don, what do you think about this? What about that? Well, I'm in a pickle, a quandary. If I just hit play, it goes 27 minutes, and it has a lot of what you've already heard. And I don't think that you necessarily want that. So may I have your blessing to do a little running through this stuff? Now, this is kind of, I hate to show anything that's not ready for public. This ain't ready for public. Would show us a little bit of the people you've been talking with. And Kathleen Verdine and I have gone from, New York City to Berkeley, Nova Scotia, Baltimore, talking with people who knew A.J. And the first person we spoke with is right here. Because I hate to tell you, Brad, but you were low-hanging fruit. He's in Chicago. Let's get him. And so we took the train over, and we got him. And boy, did we get him. But he knows so much. So we spent about 3 hours documenting what he knows. And what you will not see tonight is the record of the peace walks from San Francisco to Moscow, the peace walk from Quebec to, they tried to get to Guantanamo, but he delivered in detail how all this came together. And so we have this. Whether we make a film or not, we have all these interviews that scholars will be able to use.